my presentation is a little different from the readings that were sent out, so I was thinking a discussion would have a little bit from both, because I've been trying to put this whole book into 20 minutes. Um, Socialist Strategy and Military Art. Eventually, it will be translated and published in English, but apparently no publisher wants to touch it, which is unfortunate. It's only 800 pages of Trotskyism. Anywho, so let's get started here. For readings and this presentation seem a little heavy-handed in arguing a specific plan, what the Trotskyist fraction of the Fourth International calls a Soviet strategy. That was the intention. It is the only program that will work, and if anyone disagrees, they can keep their mouth shut. I kid, given the lack of revolutions in the past few decades, I do believe that questions of what to do and how are still somewhat open. And so I anticipate some good discussion here. But regardless of where people stand and what strategies to execute, I hope that I can lay out a methodology of military art before getting into the Soviet strategies, which I'll argue is the most coherent plan that takes into consideration historical materialism, the dialectical approach, and most importantly, the concrete global situation we find ourselves in. These things, I believe we had talked a lot about these past few weeks, and so I thank the Denver Communists for giving me this time. I want to start by saying that questions of military strategy for Marxists are not novel. Marx and Engels studied plenty of military authors, particularly the Prussian general, Karl von Clausewitz. Engels himself served in the Prussian military in his youth and fought in Baden and the Palatinate during the 1848 revolution. Later Marxists like Franz Mehring, Jean Jaurès, and Karl Kautsky also wrote on military topics, but often as metaphors for politics. Independently of each other, Lenin and Trotsky had turned to studying military affairs after the failed 1905 revolution and the start of World War I. Lenin had his 1915 notebooks, while Trotsky had previously covered the Balkan Wars, and that added to his kind of military experience. Given Trotsky's later position as the chairman of the Supreme Military Council during the Russian Civil War, he used war as a metaphor, but also had a practical view of the science, saying, "He who thinks of renouncing physical struggle must renounce all struggle, for the spirit does not live without flesh." Following the splendid phrase of the great military theoretician Clausewitz, war is a continuation of politics by other means. This definition also fully applies to civil war. Physical struggle is only another means of a political struggle. And, he also goes on to say, it is impermissible to oppose one to the other, since it is impossible to check at will the political struggle when it transforms itself by force of inner necessity into a physical struggle. The duty of a revolutionary party is to foresee in time the inescapability of a transformation of politics into open armed conflict, and with all its forces to prepare for that moment, just as ruling classes are also preparing for that moment. First I want to ask, who here plays the tabletop war game Warhammer 40K? No, it's not too relevant, but I'm always looking for more people to play against. Or maybe, a strategy video game, Total War, Hearts of Iron series, or maybe a bit more classic, chess or Go. Let's see. And, knowing all that, I don't know if anyone here wants to, oh, nice, wants to define strategy real quick. For me, strategy can have all kinds of meanings in relation to all kinds of problem. I have high blood pressure. I can have a strategy to lower it through various tactical choices of diet and exercise, making plans to walk more and use a walk more to stir fry veggies. Strategy can be a larger plan, while tactics make up the short-term goals, leading towards some conclusion. In chess, one must checkmate the king while making smaller tactical maneuvers. Like forks and pins, sacrifices, and Zug. Go, being a larger board, has a clearer distinction between strategy and tactics in service of the victory objective of controlling more territory of the opponent. But it's easy to see how tactics morph into strategy in both examples. When one moves into military revolutionary strategy, the only way out of a recursion of strategy being made up of tactics in itself becoming just another tactic for a strategy further down the line, I believe in a final analysis, you must take with something. So let's say it's the art of winning. And I'll back that up with some quotes here. Here's Lawrence Friedman. Strategy is the central political art. It is about getting more out of a situation than the starting balance of power would suggest. It is the art of creating power. And Trotsky, victory is not at all a ripe fruit of a proletariat's maturity. Victory is a strategic task. Of course, if we're broadening the concept of strategy to mean the art of winning or of creating power or achieving victory, then what in the Charlie Sheen is winning? For there to be a war, either between nations or between classes, there are naturally two or more sides. So again, the simplest way of finding a commonality between all possible conflicts is to say that winning is one side imposing its will on the other. Sun Tzu said, therefore, the clever combatant imposes his will on the enemy, but does not allow the enemy's will to be imposed on him. And Clausewitz similarly believed that strategy was the art, it was the use of partial tactical struggle for the purpose of imposing one's will on the enemy. So if winning is the imposition of a worker's will on the capitalist class, then a lot of what gets discussed by the broad left isn't actually strategy. For example, Syriza in Greece, lacking a perspective for the conquest of power, clearly saw itself as the left-wing administration of the existing order. They resisted some of the more atrocious austerity measures from the Troika, but to win, they would have required a political and physical break, a civil war. For Clausewitz, they would have had to go on the offensive, uh, because absolute defense, so to quote Clausewitz, absolute defense completely contradicts the idea of war, because there would then be war only carried on by one side. And here we move to an important concept in strategy, which is a relationship between defense and offense. I'm sure some of us here enjoy sports, either playing or watching them. I played rugby in college myself, and I still enjoy watching it. Um, I watched Argentina win World Cup, here watching on the big screens in Jujuy. And one of the most exciting moments in many sports is a transition from defense to offense when the ball is taken in some way. Often those transitions lead to points unless the side now on the defensive moves quickly enough. In the final analysis, discounting ties in football, the side that wins scored the most points because they were most effective on the offense. They were able to do more with the assets they had at hand, which is of course an equal number of players on each side. So when it comes to revolutionary strategy and defense offense dichotomy, it might be helpful to go back to the apocryphal exchange between Louis XVI and La Rochefoucauld-Liancourt. Is it revolt? No, sire, it is a revolution. Revolts, be they demonstrations, riots, or even general strikes, pressure, the government or corporations or both to grant concessions. They often start defensively as some protection of rights or standard of living. And once it starts to move outside the bounds of existing structure, it starts to become a revolution, which is the ultimate offensive, since it seeks to overturn uh, the world order and impose the will of workers, and winning. So let's keep defense and offense in mind while we move on. To step back to Clausewitz, we must remember that in war, the other side is not some inert thing. If it were, there is no war, according to Clausewitz. In war, one side pushes against, quote, a living and reacting force. And this is just to say that the capitalist class learns and learned from the Russian Revolution and various movements afterwards. Um, Here we go to Gramsci to discuss how states learn from these crises, with the then Russian Revolution and the Italian experience in mind, and a long tradition in Marxist canon distinguishing Western and Eastern state formations. Gramsci came up with the concept of the extended state to explain how Western states differ and what might be needed for revolution in liberal democracies. In the extended state, a ruling class may resort to violent repression from time to time, but it prefers to build hegemony. There is no alternative common sense through all means at its disposals. schools, universities, media, think tanks, all the kind of ideological stuff. Here, too, we can recall Marxist historical materialism about how the ideas of a ruling class are in every epoch of ruling ideas, i.e., the class which is a ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. We can also remember how Lenin organized the Bolsheviks with that challenge in mind. And that's the big point of what is to be done. But Gramsci goes further with his extended state. The state goes beyond the passive expectation of consensus and tries to actively organize society. It may take on social welfare measures. It may take on, it co-ops union and NGO bureaucracies in the name of giving them a seat at the table. It may even impose union contracts, such as what just happened to rail workers a few years ago and what happened to auto workers in 2008, following the crash. To Gramsci, the bourgeoisie thus conquers, quote, a set of forces organized by the state and by individuals to protect the political and economic domination of the ruling classes, turning political parties and other economic and other organizations into political police agencies of an investigative and preventative character. Let's see here. I think that's a good explanation of union bureaucracy, to be honest. The subjective or active measures undertaken by states, that living and reacting force of the enemy, as Clausewitz would say, helps to fragment the working class. But the greatest factor in the fragmentation of a working class has come from objective economic factors following the decades-long neoliberal offensive powered by the expansion of capitalism into the Eastern Bloc and China. An offensive colloquially known, though not entirely accurate, as trickle-down economics. This fragmentation explains how the working class and urban populations are a lot larger than they've ever been. We're finally at a majority of the world's population, but the class as a whole is weaker. It is more heterogeneous. There are more divisions and more sectors. Beyond the crucial questions of race, sex, gender, sexuality, and other forms of special oppression, you have workers can be unionized or non-unionized, documented or undocumented, contracted or subcontracted on first tier, second tier, or temp contracts, in the formal economy or in the informal or gig. All these and more divisions can fragment whole industries and even within individual workplaces. Such as like how the striking workers, notably at Kellogg and the Big Three, kind of shined light on the fact that people are getting paid differently doing the same work. They had that demand of equal pay for equal work. I think this is an international phenomenon, from U.S. to here in Argentina, South Korea, and pretty much everywhere. Let's see here. Now, I'll take here for granted that we all agree with basic Marxist principles. The working class alone has the power to paralyze society and change it, and a privileged place as the articulator of an independent power, one that can unite the exploited and oppressed people and show that with self-organization and self-defense, we can defeat the bourgeois state. But I will note one more division because capitalism is based on the extraction of surplus value at the point of production, and because of its complexity, some parts of our class, particularly in the primary and secondary sectors, hold strategic positions within the productive process, where they can, quote, determine the production of many others, whether within a company or throughout the economy, as best described by John Womack Jr. Of course, this firepower from one sector can lead to revolutionary or corporatist conclusions. They can be bought off because of how much power they have, or they can, lead a revolution. We'll keep all this in mind when we get to the Soviet strategy, but I will note that the Sincada plant, described in that Bolivia piece we read, is an example of, a strategic position. So the working class must find unity, and that unity is hindered by the economy and the whole structure of a capitalist state that reinforces it through the statization of the unions, the interval state that Gramsci was talking about. And so if we take into consideration both punches of this 1-2 being dished out by economic conditions and the extended state, we have a situation in which workers are divided and their leaderships, mostly through the unions, declined to fight against those divisions, and often they outright exasperate them. Throughout 2019, across Latin America and Europe, where there are millions on the streets, union leaders refused to lead strikes against coups, in Bolivia, labor reforms in Chile and elsewhere, pension reforms in France, as the cases may be. In 2020, the George Floyd rebellion was the largest in US history, yet labor was, what was I going to say, played a mostly passive role. Workers participated, as citizens mostly, and they were definitely out in the streets, but they weren't participating as workers on strike. Their organizations were dormant. It is perhaps controversial, but the Trotskyist fraction considers the union bureaucracy the, quote, advanced attachment to organized bourgeois hegemony within the organizations of the proletariat, and the Trotskyist fraction is not alone. In Trotsky's unfinished 1940 article, Trade Unions in the Epoch of Imperialist Decay, he wrote, monopoly capitalism is less and less willing to reconcile itself to the independence of trade unions. It demands of a reformist bureaucracy and the labor aristocracy who picks the crumbs from its banquet table, that they become transformed into its political police before the eyes of a working class. So Trotsky and Gramsci may not have spoken too much, but it's interesting that they both called union bureaucrats cops. And someone who's kind of done the whole union organizing thing, I think they're pretty right. Alrighty then. Returning to strategy, we can learn from military art, but there is one major difference between the typical general of a nation and a revolutionary leadership. The general is presented with an army recruited, either volunteered or conscripted, and armed through the normal functions of a state. To make a revolution, to carry through an insurrection and win the likely ensuing civil war, a revolutionary party must build the army, figuratively and often quite literally. Strategy, then, for revolutionaries does not start with operations like, storming the Winter Palace, but must start much earlier with building the party that intends to win. Strategic work, coordinating the volumes of forces available for combat, is indispensable no matter the size of a party. And here again, I'm taking for granted that we all agree on the importance of a revolutionary party. This comes from our understanding of the Bolsheviks as organizers of a vanguard of the working class. That is, if we want to reach the masses, we must organize and politicize the most advanced workers, those who, for various reasons, have experience and the will to fight. Revolutionaries are a minority until we aren't, and the party is that lever that moves people. The strategy for a revolutionary party tends to fight on two temporal fronts. There's the training of the worker militants through education, all sorts of minor daily struggles. And then there's the decisive activity that makes up Trotsky's three phases of an insurrection, the preparation, the insurrection itself, and its consolidation. Obviously, as class struggle intensifies and instability grows, there are more sudden shifts in the balance of power, and that latter activity, the trying to make insurrection, all that kind of stuff, that one grows in importance. One can only hope then that the training of the party and its militants, especially the sharpening of its leadership, will be sufficient enough to thumb the scales at the deciding moment. The importance of timing being another similarity between wars, revolution, and comedy. We return to Trotsky. A revolutionary situation is formed by the reciprocal action of objective and subjective factors. It does not fall from the sky. It takes form with class struggle. Kautsky at his best, and some of the older generation of social democrats may not actually have disagreed too much with the above, but they would have argued there were two stages, that each one necessitating different strategies. That one can have a strategy for a normally functioning society and another for crises. Yeah, this was kind of in the Luxembourg reading we did a few weeks ago. The novelty of communist revolutionaries was to argue that one needed a strategy that operated on both fields, because the line between normal society and pre-revolutionary situations is thin. As students of dialectics, we understand how even slow changes in quantity can explode into qualitative leaps, like how February of 2020 was a very different world than, within a month later. And even though things have, stabilized somewhat, um, given the environmental situation, that line may be even thinner. With all this said, what strategy should revolutionaries and their parties pursue that takes into consideration a world situation, the extended states, the need to unite workers across our strategic positions to bring to bear our full might, how to move from defense to offense, or in other words, how to turn revolts that seem to pop off somewhere in the world every few months into revolutions. And so we turn to the Soviet strategy, best summarized by Nathaniel, Flakin in Soviet Strategy, a primer. And I think vital to that strategy is a tactic of the united front. And so what is a united front? Here I'm going to give you a definition from the Fourth World Congress of the Communist International. The united front tactic is simply an initiative whereby the communists propose to join with all workers belonging to other parties and groups and all unaligned workers in a common struggle to defend the immediate basic interests of a working class against the bourgeoisie. In military metaphor, kind of continue that spirit, it means to march separately but strike together. The basic idea is to call them bureaucracies to join specific struggles. If they join, the members fight alongside communists, and if they refuse, members will see their leaders refusing to fight for basic demands. Thus, this tactic is meant to solve the problem of the fragmentation of the working class, described above. It is meant to weaken the hold of the bureaucracies, while also building the broadest force possible in the effort to win some reform or concession. United fronts often begin on the defensive, in defense against assaults on our standard of living, defense of our democratic rights, defense against fascist violence, with successful actions building confidence and capacity. In the struggle against the bureaucracies, through the United Front tactic, the working class flexes its muscle as an independent class. This is a prerequisite for building workers' hegemony. Should conditions destabilize further, partially because successful united fronts beget stronger counterattacks by the state, then the door is open for more radical activity. If conditions allow, and if there's a revolutionary party fighting for it, defensive united fronts can go on the offensive and become bodies for revolutionary change in society, organs that unites the entire working class for general struggle. And here, of course, I'm talking about Soviets. The Russian term for workers' councils. Throughout the decades, we've had other names like Rote in Germany, Cordones Industriales in Spanish, Shuras in Persian, but the premise remains the same. Historical materialism, we've all talked about plenty of times, places economic activity at the heart of society. And so it makes sense that throughout the years in many parts of the world, there's almost a social law that when masses rise up, they tend to build workers' councils to self-organize democratically. To build united fronts that we hope will be transformed into Soviets, the two preparatory tasks put forward by Nathaniel are correct. We must form organizations with an uncompromisingly revolutionary program while sinking roots in a working class, and we must develop forms of self-organization in every conflict. This second principle is vital and can be used in union or social movement settings. If we take seriously Marx's address to the First International, that the emancipation of working class must be conquered by the working classes themselves, we must do what we can to prepare workers to rule. Capitalism in liberal democracy leaves very little opportunity to practice democracy. Union workers may have a little more practice in sometimes quarterly local meetings, sometimes monthly if you've got, particularly democratic union, but frequently union members have little say even who leads their union and when they will strike. The growth in reform caucuses based on union democracy is evidence of many union members' frustrations. NGOs tend to be run like fiefdoms by some unaccountable board receiving money from God knows where. Yeah. So by being zealots for assemblies or other bodies of self-organization, we can help amalgamate sectors of a working class, bringing together the energy from auxiliary social movements to the workers in strategic positions, who for all kinds of reasons are oftentimes more slow to move, but once they do, they pack the biggest punch. Of course, given the liveliness of industrial labor in the US right now, that energy could be brought to tertiary sectors. Self-organization also allows communists to advance our politics to more people and propose our own plans to every fight. It is in these bodies that we build that we can win more people and construct united fronts of sufficient size to actually be a united front, to bring in board these bureaucracies that mislead the workers. Let's see here. Yeah, and to build fractions within unions and social movements and everywhere to recruit more soldiers to a cause, since as stated before in revolutionary strategy, we have to build our own forces.